Thank you, Gene. It's a rather daunting assignment to give a last lecture. A little bit scary. Benjamin Franklin once said that when people come to write their autobiography, particularly old men, it's a marvelous way for them to simply talk about themselves. And I'm also reminded that it is John Updike who said the scary thing is that as we get old, we tend to remember things that never happened. So I must warn you, I hope what I say today will not be self-serving, and I hope that it will be real, but it's also a last opportunity for me to do some public reflection on the marvelous 10.5 years that I've enjoyed here with all of you. I think one additional caveat that I would state is that in talking about the Lake Institute on Faith and Giving and talking a little bit about myself, I have to talk about religion and theology. And I hope that that word theology doesn't put you off. It comes from two ancient Greek words that simply mean God talk. And religion and theology have to do with how do we talk about, how do we understand God. Which when you stop to think about it, suggests that theology is really somewhat experiential and autobiographical, which has an intriguing implication for philanthropy, because what we know from our studies is that religion is a major motivation for many donors. So if we're going to understand donors, we have to understand what is the faith-based background from which they come. When I ask myself the question, who is Bill Enright, I describe myself genetically as a religious mongrel, a mixed breed. My father was a Roman Catholic. My mother grew up in more in the Anabaptist tradition. When I was a few weeks old, I was taken to St. Patrick Catholic Church in Peoria, Illinois, my hometown, where I was baptized into the one holy Catholic Church. But my parents divorced when I was very young, so I spent all of my formative years with a very, very loving family that reflected more my mother's religious tradition. So when I came to college and I was on my own, I became a Presbyterian. And for the last 50 years have been an ordained Presbyterian clergy. Which means that over that span of time, I've worn a number of different hats. Pastor, preacher, seminary professor, author, community organizer amidst racial changes on the south side of Chicago in the early 1960s, involved in interfaith ventures, and for the past 10.5 years in what my wife describes as my encore career, the director of the Lake Institute here at the Lilly Family School of Philanthropy. In short, I've been one blessed man. But when I look back through the lens of theology, what do I see? What did I learn? And I would describe it simply this way, that God is bigger than any human label we can harness to describe the mystery of the divine. And I hope that whatever your religious persuasion, you embrace it with conviction, but not so rigidly and narrowly as to write off people of other religious persuasions. We have a lot of pop labels we like to use in religion. We call people liberal, progressive, conservative, evangelical, etc. And I want you to beware of all those labels. They can be as harmful as they are helpful. And often they simply become pegs on which we hang people with whom we happen to disagree. And when we do that, we become ineffective as fundraisers, because we are not really willing to open ourselves to where a person thinks and where they come from. One of the great learnings that I think I have observed here at the School of Philanthropy is that in philanthropy we embrace what I call a balcony view of life. Savvy fundraisers know how to engage a donor's values to enhance generous giving. And so what I'd like to say to you as I begin today is simply, get over your skittishness about religion. It's here to stay. as my good Muslim friend Ibu Patel, on whose board Gene said I served, says, religion, like it or not, is a front page issue in this 21st century. And if we're going to survive and flourish in this century, we have to learn how to reckon with religion and the religious values of people. But I don't want this lecture to be about me. I want it to be about the Lake Institute on Faith and Giving, and the School of Philanthropy that for the past decade has been a laboratory for observation and learning. And also, I must say, the perfect setting for me to live out my faith and my calling. So this morning I want to do two things. I'd like to share with you a little bit about the story of the Lake Institute. And second, I would like to reflect on how and what we do and how it relates to the larger mission of the School of Philanthropy. Lake Institute is the generous bequest of you, as most of you know, of Tom and Marjorie Lake and their daughter Karen Lake Buttrey. Let me tell you a little bit about them. Tom and Marjorie grew up in Salisbury, Pennsylvania, a small coal mining community. Marjorie's father was the town doctor. He also owned the drugstore where Tom had worked as a teenage soda jerk. Tom's father was a coal miner. Marjorie at times told me the story of how, as a small girl during the recession in the 1920s, she would accompany her father on house calls when frequently he was not paid but given a chicken or a dozen eggs. And she said, it was at that time that I learned that in my family, our responsibility was to give back to the community, to care for the needy and the poor. Tom reflected on how every Friday afternoon his father would bring home from the coal mine a brown envelope holding the cash paid for the week. And Tom said, I would watch as my dad would give that envelope to my mother would take out a certain percentage from the envelope, put it in a little glass jar in our cupboard, and that was our offering, a little Presbyterian church we attended each Sunday. As he grew older, Tom said, as I reflected and watched that ritual unfold week after month after year, I learned something very, very important. I learned that one of life's important lessons is that regardless of our economic status, we humans were created to be givers, not takers. Well, Tom won a scholarship, graduated from Temple University with a double major in pharmacy and chemistry. Marjorie graduated as an economics major from the College of William and Mary. They were married early in World War II, and then following the war, Tom took a job with Eli Lilly and Company. He rose to be president of that company. He retired early in the mid-1970s, but for Tom, retirement didn't last very long. He was retired only a few months when Mr. Eli Lilly, who was still alive, asked Tom to come and help a young fledgling organization that was experiencing a bit of a crisis. You know that organization today as the Lilly Endowment. And from 1977 until his death in 1999, Tom served as the president, the chairman of the board, and then in his last years as chairman emeritus of the endowment. At Tom's death, and I should say Marjorie died in the year 2001. At Tom's death, the directors of the endowment authorized that a grant for $500,000 be given to whatever institution the family desired. So Indiana University, the family designated as to be the recipient of that gift. And it was that grant, with a subsequent bequest for the Lake family estate, as well as the generosity of the late Karen Lake Buttrey and her husband Don, that gave birth to the Lake Institute. I recall the inaugural luncheon back in the year 2002 when Karen Lake Buttrey said this about her father, and I quote, "Dad was a practical, very down-to-earth man. He did not have much use for words and ideas if they weren't about to influence the behavior of individuals." Tom Lake himself often said, generosity and sharing is something that must be taught. And so the Lake Institute was born to nurture thoughtful giving by fostering a greater understanding of the ways in which faith inspires and informs giving. Now, the opportunity, the invitation for me to serve as the founding director of the Lake Institute has been a very, very personal calling, and for this reason. For 23 years, I was the Lake family's pastor, friend, and conversation partner. So maybe you understand how during these past 10 years there are two questions that have sat center stage in my mind. Question number one, is what we do truly reflective of the values of Tom Lake? And question number two, in our mission, are we serving the mission, the vision rather, that Karen Lake Buttry had for what we do? Tom Lake had three simple aphorisms that shaped his life, and he shared these with people on many, many different occasions. First he said, surround yourself with people who are brighter than you are. Well, that's rather easy for me to do. And I have to tell you that for the last decade, in this place, I felt like a kid in a candy store, as I have been able to savor the learnings and insightful droppings from some of the bright minds seated around this table. This is a unique, a very stimulating place to work. And I hope that each of you and those of you who are new this morning come to realize over time how very, very special this place is. Tom's second aphorism was, surround yourself with young people. Now let me tell you, that's really a gift for an old guy. And the youthful curiosity of this place is a rejuvenating treasure. As the old guy, I have been blessed to be surrounded by young people like Amy and Karen and Richard, and before them Natalie and Ashley and Rich. And many of you, such as my friend Tim Seiler, who is sitting there, have served incognito as my teachers and mentors during these years. And all of you, for which I am very grateful, have shown an uncommon patience towards this old guy who sometimes is somewhat technologically impaired. So I say thank you. It's the third aphorism, however, that I want to focus on this morning. Take time to think. When people ask me, what's the purpose of the Lake Institute? In a word, I say it is to nurture thoughtful givers. In an early planning document, our advisory board outlined our mission this way: to foster a greater understanding of the ways in which faith both inspires and informs giving by providing knowledge, education, and training. To reshape the philanthropic conversation in American society. To develop strategic partnerships with academic institutions. To alter the landscape of congregational life, and regardless of one's religious orientation, to influence individuals in their giving. Now, how do we carry out that mission? Well, we do it via programs such as the annual Thomas H. Lake Lecture on Faith and Giving and the annual Lake Distinguished Visitors Program. In those programs, we further the philanthropic conversation. Via the Lake Doctoral Dissertation Fellowship, which, as Gene said, my successor David King has been a recipient, we nurture research and we support young emerging scholars. Beyond that, via seminars, we seek to integrate research with practice. And over the past 10.5 years, we have worked with over 3,200 faith-based organizations across America, literally from Hawaii to New York, from Washington to Florida and Texas. And presently, in our new work, we are working with 9 different theological institutions in our new Executive Certificate in Religious Fundraising. Tell you a little story. Friday morning, as I was sitting, the door closed in my office working on what I'd say today, there was a knock on the door, and it was Amy. She said, "Bill, will you come quickly to my office on Skype? I'm in a conversation with a woman from Australia." And she was in conversation with a woman who was the Director of Stewardship for the Catholic Diocese of Melbourne. She said, "I'm going to be in Canada in September of this year, and I've just heard about your program and how can I enroll in the certificate program at St. Mildred Seminary in September, because in Australia we ignore the religious dimension to fundraising, and I need to learn more about it. In most of our seminars, we also address the issues of philanthropic discernment as we try to provide donors with the opportunity to get in touch with their own philanthropic story and reflect on their charitable giving. Now, why is that important? Some time ago, in his book, After Virtue, the philosopher Alasdair MacIntyre noted, and I quote, that we humans are essentially storytelling animals, tellers of stories that aspire to truth. He then writes, I can only answer the question, what am I to do, if I can answer the prior question of what story or stories do I find myself to be a part. As the historian Lawrence Friedman has observed in his History of Philanthropy, people of generosity are usually people who are driven by deeply compelling visions. And I would suggest that if we're really ever going to move that needle of charitable giving beyond the 1.92% level, we must help donors find their giving story. Because thoughtful, generous giving is always somewhat autobiographical. Now, next question would be, well, what difference do these programs make? Well, let me give you a couple of examples. Sometime when you have nothing to do, jump in your car, drive down 38th Street East, until you come to that part of our city called the Meadows. It's been known for decades as a major crime area. But something exciting and transformative is happening in that neighborhood. As you drive by, you notice a cluster of charter schools, a spanking new YMCA community center, and you find the East Village Avenue Meadows, a new housing project that combines subsidized housing with fair market housing. In other words, in one apartment, and the place is already full, in one apartment is someone on welfare, on either side of them someone who pays a fair market price, on either side of them an individual who is on welfare. How did that all happen? People will tell you it directly goes back to the Lake Lecture in 2007, when a man by the name of Tom Cousin was invited from Atlanta, Georgia to share his story, and his story touched the hearts of some of the leaders and philanthropists in our city. And that's the result. Or if you want to take a trip, jump on an airplane, fly to Southern California, and go to St. Anthony Catholic Church in Upland, California. And what you'll find is that there is a whole new altar that is under reconstruction today. And that's because of Deacon Steve, who came to our seminar program last September at St. Mildred's. He had a vision, but he didn't know how to tell the story. He didn't know how to really articulate the vision, and he didn't understand donors. And they needed to do something about all those rickety steps, he said, that were part of the altar. And so in 6 months, he applied what he learned, and he raised $484,000. And that project is a reality. Sounds like a little money to some of you, but to them, that was a huge gift. Or while you're there, jump in your car and drive over to San Bernardino to Our Lady of Hope Catholic Church, where you will find Father Tony. It's a large but very poor Hispanic parish. And Father Tony was sent by his diocese because they said, Father Tony doesn't have a clue in America how to raise money, how to talk about money. And today something exciting is happening in that parish. Father Tony had a goal that he wanted to raise his offering $1,000 a week. $50,000 of new money, he said, for the year. Interesting, he reached that goal in 9 months. And so last month we granted him one of the first certificates in religious fundraising. In all of this, what have I observed? What have I learned about religious giving in these 10 years? I will make 3 observations. The first is very obvious. You all know people of faith are generous givers. Last fall, in a research project connected to Give that involved our own Mark Wilhelm, we learned that 73% of all charitable dollars from individuals go to congregations or to religiously identified organizations. We also learned in that study that donors said that, the majority of donors said that their giving was driven by religious or spiritual values. Earlier in our own research in COPS and other research, we have shown that people who regularly participate in a faith-based community are anywhere from 2 to 4 times more generous in all their charitable giving than those who participate less regularly or not at all. And as Robert Putnam has put it, the key is not really participation. The key is that those people are part of what we call social networks. And religious congregations are composed of a curious array of social networks, which we have yet to unpack how that can spur an even greater giving. Despite of the generosity, fact is that, as the sociologist Robert Wuthnow put it some time ago, the taboo of money talk is alive and well in religious congregations. What's a taboo? It is something that is so sacred that to touch it or talk about it is to expose oneself to considerable danger. You've maybe observed, most religious communities don't talk easily about money. And consequently, in many of those communities and congregations, fundraising is viewed at best as a necessary evil. As for clergy, most of them are ill-equipped to talk about money because they have no training in fiscal matters. They are, and rightfully, aware of all of the vices of materialism. But unfortunately, that leads some of them to have a more negative than positive view of money. And the upshot, as the Catholic priest Henry Nouwen has noted in a wonderful little book called The Spirituality of Fundraising, is that many clergy carry a prejudice against the rich. Which means that you then engage in fundraising with one arm tied behind your back. And it means that frequently when you do talk about money, it simply comes across as a public scold. I think the thing that has surprised me the most is that clergy are surprisingly ignorant of the historic teachings of their faith traditions. In the Abrahamic tradition, there are such rich, rich resources about the role of money and the faithful use of possessions. Let me illustrate from the Christian tradition. Biblical scholars tell us that Jesus had more to say about money and the faithful use of possession than any other subject. As a matter of fact, there's more in the Bible about money and possessions than there is about love and prayer. In his recently magisterial book, Through the Eye of a Needle, Princeton historian Peter Brown notes that in the later Roman Empire, the gift of the Judeo-Christian heritage was a new departure, a new understanding of charity, with charity as caring for the poor that they called almsgiving. And thus civic giving was juxtaposed as against almsgiving, or caring for the poor. Brown goes on to note that for Christians, and I quote, it was the doctrine of the incarnation, the idea of God coming into human society in the form of a human being, Jesus of Nazareth, that added greater density and dramatic power to the notion of giving generously. That many clergy seem to be ignorant of their own tradition. So while people of faith are generous, the taboo of money talk is alive, and religious organizations appear to not necessarily be structured to be fiscally effective. Most religious congregations, institutions, reflect a 20th century organizational structure. Some would say medieval. Highly bureaucratic, inwardly focused, politically sensitive, risk adverse, with top-down management. Now think about that. Are such organizations truly welcoming to 21st century givers? Furthermore, the taboo of money talks means that in many of these organizations, giving is not an expectation even for people who serve on religious boards and agencies. And all too frequently in congregations, as studied, nonprofits in Indiana showed some time ago, religious congregations are not particularly transparent, nor are they publicly accountable for the use they make of the funds that people have given to them. Religious congregations have different pots of money, they have different budgets, but all of that makes data gathering more like a patchwork quilt than truly a science. In her book, Leading the Fundraising Charge, Carla Williams, who's on the adjunct faculty of our fundraising school, offers a number of keys as to what makes for effective fundraising. And she uses a couple of words. Two of those words are attitude and advocacy. And around the word attitude, she asks this question: how does leadership in an organization feel about fundraising as a core value? And relative to advocacy, she says, and how do the members of an organization articulate the mission of that institution? Sadly, it's my observation that many religious congregations fail that test, which surprisingly also, or perhaps not surprisingly, leads to this insight. While during their lifetime many people have their local congregations as the recipient of the bulk of their charitable dollars, they do not remember that congregation in their estate planning. Why? Because, as one piece of research shows, they do not believe that their congregation would know how to make a good use of that gift. In other words, they have not created transparency and built trust. Religious fundraising is unique. It's different than any other kind of fundraising. Think, for example, about this. Think about the giving practices and rituals that are unique to religious institutions. Or think about this all too common religious notion: hey, we don't have to worry about money, God will provide. Or think about many religious congregations. My observation is many of them come out of a Germanic ethnic background, who believe that clergy should have nothing to do with money or fundraising, because money and giving is not in any way spiritual. All of this makes the study of religious giving most intriguing, while at the same time, at least a tad, complex. Ironically, in spite of all of these ills, religious giving continues to flourish, which in my mind raises this question: what is religious giving? Is it giving to religious congregations and organizations whose purpose is essentially religious? Or is it any charitable gift that is motivated by religious and spiritual values? In other words, do we focus on the institution receiving the gift or the donor who gives the gift? So, how does Lake Institute address these challenges? Our pedagogical style is what we call experiential learning. Our clientele reflect numerous organizations, no two of which are ever alike. And our goal in our seminars is simply to wake up our participants to the realities of the world in which they work and live, and to help them unpack what is unique about their own giving story. So the waking up process involves these 4 steps as described by David Call. We ask people to reflect on their own experience. And then as they reflect and observe, think about what is going on, that leads to a critical analysis and some new insights. And finally, that leads to testing and experimentation. What changes are they going to make? How will they implement those changes if they are to have a vital tomorrow. A couple of examples. In our Creating Congregational Cultures of Generosity seminar, we make use of the giving pyramid. We borrow this from the fundraising school, but we give it a little different twist. We view it as a diagnostic instrument. So if you're in our seminar, the first day we'll talk about the giving pyramid, and you have a take-home assignment. Your take-home assignment is when we come back 2 months down the road to come back with an analysis of the top 10% of your giving pyramid. And I say to you, I want to know everything. I expect you to put a name and a dollar amount to every donor. I want you to describe for me the age of that donor, their background, their degree of participation, etc. And when we come back in 2 months, I'm going to ask you one question. When you look at that top 10%, describe for me the profile of a generous giver in your organization. Well, I need to tell you that when we come back together, that is one teachable moment. What people learn is that their donor base is often very old, and it is skewed by someone who is really generous. One simple example, group of congregations, Northern Indiana, I think this one was from Michigan City. When they came to report, they said, you know, we have a problem. All that top 10%, they're all over 65 years of age. And you know, we have one person who is really generous. I mean, this person is so generous that we could never make up what they give in 1 year. And that person is 99 years of age. Now, what's tomorrow look like for that congregation, that organization? And we begin the conversation. In our 4-day executive certificate program, the second day seminar is titled Nurturing Generous Donors. And in the afternoon, we look at donor profiles, donor motivations, but in the morning, we ask each participant to assess their own giving profile and to unravel their own philanthropic story. And as a last assignment, we ask them to write a letter to a member of their family in which they talk about their life, their experience, and how their values and experience to shape the use they're making of the resources with which they've been blessed. We're finding that to be a very emotional moment for these people because they've never thought about it before. And ironically, when we crafted the idea, we thought that that letter would be descriptive. But what we're finding is, as frequently, it is becoming prescriptive. Now that they understand themselves, they're going to handle their own giving in a different way, which means that they then understand how donors feel and how donors give. I don't think you can be a good fundraiser unless you, first of all, understand your own giving and understand your own view of money. What's money about? What is it for? Finally, we ask the question, what are the concepts, the ideas that we use to get at the underlying issues in religious communities? Well, we tend to focus our seminars on two moral virtues, gratitude and generosity. Poet Mary Oliver, in one of her poems called Sometime, has a line and she says, "These are the instructions for living life. Pay attention, be astonished, tell what you see." Now, think about that for a minute. Cicero called